Hey there, welcome to Cozy Historian. Tonight we're travelling to a quiet Colombian town, a place that once shimmered under the shadow of the Andes, a place where the streets were lined with coffee shops and laughter, where children played soccer until the light faded behind the mountains. But one November night, the mountain moved, and by dawn there was no town left to wake up. In the ruins, rescuers found a 13-year-old girl named Omayra, trapped, calm, and impossibly brave, her face becoming the human symbol of a tragedy the world would never forget. This is not a story about fire or war. It's about something older, something that had been sleeping for centuries, until the earth decided to remind everyone who was really in charge. So dim the lights, pull your blanket a little closer, get yourself comfortable. And before we get started, take a second to subscribe and say hello to your fellow historians in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach. Now, let's step into the night Armero disappeared. Long before tragedy, Armero was called the White City. From above, its streets shimmered, pale walls and tile roofs glowing under the Colombian sun. It sat on fertile land in the Tolima region, nourished by the Lagunilla River, at the foot of a majestic volcano called Nevado del Ruiz. The volcano was ancient, older than memory, older than any story the people of Armero could tell, standing at about 17,457 feet, 5,321 metres, above sea level. Its snow-capped summit gleamed like a crown against the sky. But like most old things, it was treated with polite indifference. After notable activity in 1595 and 1845, the volcano had been quiet for about 69 years before 1985. By 1985, the volcano was just part of the scenery, a snow-capped backdrop for wedding photos and postcards. People would point to it and smile, proud of the mountain that watched over their lives. Armero was home to around 28,000–29,000 people. It was prosperous, peaceful, and proud. The town was a centre for cotton and rice farming, blessed with soil enriched by centuries of volcanic deposits. Coffee farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and students filled its streets. There were schools, churches, cinemas, even an annual festival that drew visitors from nearby towns. The main plaza, Parque Los Fundadores, served as the heart of the community. Families gathered there on Sunday afternoons. Children chased each other around the central fountain, while their parents chatted on wooden benches. The main church stood nearby, its cupola visible from almost anywhere in town. To the locals, Nevado del Ruiz wasn't a threat. It was a neighbour, a sleeping one, a benevolent giant that gave them rich soil and fresh water from its melting glaciers, water that fed 40 surrounding towns through the rivers flowing down its flanks. They had no reason to fear it. After all, it had been quiet for so long. In November 1984, exactly 1 year before the catastrophe, climbers on Nevado del Ruiz noticed something unusual. Gas was emerging from the summit crater, thin wisps of steam rising into the cold mountain air. It was the first whisper of what was to come. By December, people living within 20 to 30 kilometres of the volcano felt 3 distinct earthquakes, not strong enough to cause damage, but enough to make dishes rattle and dogs bark nervously in the night. The mountain was waking up. In January 1985, geothermal researchers from the Central Hidroeléctrica de Caldas visited the summit. They discovered that a new pit had formed at the bottom of the crater, a dark wound in the ice that hadn't been there before. Steam rose from it continuously, carrying the sharp scent of sulphur. Scientists from Bogotá were dispatched to study it. They set up seismographs, gas sensors, and monitoring stations along the slopes. Though Colombia had limited equipment for volcano monitoring, and much of it had to be borrowed or donated from other countries, their findings were concerning. The volcano was definitely waking up. Magma was rising slowly through the mountain's interior, pushing upward after 69 years of dormancy. By September, fumaroles, vents in the Earth's surface, spewed steam and sulphur high into the air. The smell drifted down the mountainside, acrid and unmistakable. Farmers noticed ash settling on their crops like grey snow. Some of them joked about it, others grew quiet and worried. On September 11th, Nevado del Ruiz produced a moderate explosive eruption. It wasn't large, but it sent a lahar, the volcanic mudflow, down the mountain. Lahars descended drainages, causing damage but no deaths. It was a warning shot, a preview of what the mountain could do. This was the moment that finally got everyone's attention. Scientists worked urgently to create a hazard map, analysing the paths that lahars would likely take in the event of a larger eruption. They studied the topography, the river valleys, the settlements below. They ran simulations and calculations. The map was completed on October 7th, 1985. It showed potential paths for lahars with chilling precision. And there, marked in red, the highest danger zone, sat Armero. The scientists from Indominus, Colombia's Institute of Mining and Geology, declared in their report that a moderate eruption would produce a 100% probability of mud flows with great danger for Armero, Ambalema and the lower part of the River Chinchina. 100% probability. Copies of that map were prepared for distribution. Very few copies were distributed, and the map was poorly disseminated, though some newspapers reprinted versions. La Patria published one in early March, and several of the country's major papers featured it. But many of the people at highest risk never saw it. Henry Villegas of Indominus would later state that the hazard maps clearly demonstrated that Armero would be affected by lahars, but the map met with strong opposition from economic interests. Local officials dismissed the scientists as alarmists. Business leaders worried that evacuation orders would ruin the economy. The harvest season was approaching, and fear would drive people away. The church urged calm, saying faith was stronger than fear and that God would protect the faithful. Even when small eruptions rattled the mountain in October and early November, few took it seriously. People joked about it. They'd point to the snow-covered summit and say, "It's just steam. The old man is smoking again." By November 10th, continuous earth tremors were shaking the region. A group of scientists visited the crater on November 12th to assess the situation. They looked into the steaming pit, measured temperatures and gas emissions, but saw nothing to suggest imminent danger. They did not recommend an evacuation, but deep below their feet the volcano was screaming. Seismographs recorded what volcanologists call long-period earthquakes, seismic signals that begin strongly and then slowly die out. Years later, scientists analysing the data would recognise these signals as clear indicators that an eruption was imminent. Volcanologist Bernard Chouet would say that the volcano was screaming, "I'm about to explode." But the scientists studying Ruiz at the time didn't yet understand how to read those signals. The technology existed, the warnings were there, but no one knew how to hear them. On November 13th, 1985, the smoke turned black. Wednesday, November the 13th, a normal day, as far as anyone in Armero could tell. The morning came with overcast skies. People went to work, children attended school, shopkeepers opened their doors. The coffee harvest was in full swing, and farmers were busy in the fields. Around 3:45 in the afternoon, the volcano began its final warning. At first, it was subtle, a low rumble that most people couldn't hear over the sounds of daily life. But the seismographs registered it immediately, a sudden change in activity after a relatively quiet morning. By 4 o'clock, ash began to fall. In Armero, people noticed it first as a faint grey dusting on cars and windowsills. Some brushed it off, annoyed. Others looked up at the sky, squinting toward the distant mountain. As the afternoon wore on, the ashfall grew heavier. By 5:30, larger particles, volcanic lapilli, fragments of hardened lava, began landing in the streets with soft tapping sounds. Children collected them like pebbles. Adults grew uneasy. Messages that evening were mixed. Some local guidance emphasized staying calm indoors, while critical evacuation warnings failed to reach many residents. Radio and television stations broadcast conflicting information. Some urged caution, others urged calm. No unified evacuation order was given. In the town hall, officials debated what to do: evacuate or wait. The reports from the volcano monitoring station were unclear. Scientists said the eruption was moderate, not necessarily catastrophic, and evacuating 28,000 people on short notice at night with no clear plan. It seemed rash, premature, better to wait and see. Darkness fell over Armero around 6 o'clock. The streetlights flickered on. Families gathered for dinner. Some people prepared to leave anyway. The ash had unnerved them, and they decided not to take chances. They packed bags, loaded their cars, and drove away into the night. But most stayed. They trusted the authorities. They believed that if something was truly wrong, they would be told. At about 9:09 that evening, the situation changed. A series of powerful explosions shook Nevado del Ruiz. Magma surged upward through the crater, punching through the ice cap with immense force. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated rock, ash, and gas, roared down the upper slopes at hundreds of kilometers per hour. The flows weren't large enough to reach Armero directly. The town was too far away, about 46 kilometers from the summit. But the pyroclastic flows did something far worse. They melted the glaciers, about 10% of the ice cap. Millions of tons of ice, liquefied within minutes. The meltwater mixed with loose volcanic ash, soil, and rock debris on the mountainside, creating a devastating slurry. And then, pulled by gravity, it began to move. 4 massive lahars, volcanic mud flows, roared down the mountain following the river, valleys carved into its flanks. They gained speed as they descended, scouring the riverbanks, tearing away trees, boulders, and everything else in their path. The largest of these lahars followed the valley of the Lagunilla River, straight toward Armero. The people of Armero had no way of seeing what was coming. The lahar moved in near total darkness, its roar hidden by the distance and the sound of rain that had begun to fall over the town. Travelling at speeds of 50 to 60 kilometers per hour, the mud flow covered the 46-kilometer distance from the volcano to Armero in just over 2 hours. At about 11:35, the lahar reached the edge of town. Some people heard it before they saw it. A deep, vibrating sound like distant thunder, but continuous, growing louder. Others felt it first, a tremor in the ground as if a train were passing nearby. And then it hit. The lahar came in pulses. Field investigations found a colder first pulse, followed by a hotter, darker second pulse. The first wave struck the northern part of Armero with the force of a freight train. It demolished everything it touched. Houses, shops, trees, power lines. Walls collapsed like cardboard. Roofs were ripped away and carried downstream. People who had been asleep woke to the sound of their homes being torn apart. Those who were awake had seconds to react. Some ran. Some climbed onto roofs. Some tried to hold onto trees, streetlights, anything solid. Many were swept away immediately, pulled under by the weight of the mud. The lahar was thick, not like water, but like wet concrete. It moved with terrifying force, but also with a kind of slow, deliberate weight. Once it caught you, there was no escaping it. and it just kept coming. Wave after wave, each one higher, thicker, more destructive than the last. Within minutes, the entire town was submerged beneath up to 5 meters of mud. Buildings that hadn't been knocked down were simply buried. Streets vanished. The central plaza, where children had played just hours before, was gone, swallowed by the earth. In the chaos, people called out for loved ones. Parents searched desperately for their children. Families were torn apart in seconds, swept in different directions by the current. Some people managed to survive by clinging to floating debris, pieces of roof, tree trunks, furniture. They drifted through the darkness, surrounded by the screams of others who weren't as fortunate. The town's mayor, Ramon Rodriguez, was at the town hall when the lahar struck. He managed to get through on the radio one last time, sending a final transmission to the outside world. His last words were, "Wait a minute, I think the town is getting flooded." Then the line went dead. By midnight, Armero had ceased to exist. Of the town's 28 to 29,000 residents, more than 20,000 were gone. As dawn broke on November 14th, the scale of the catastrophe became clear. Armero was unrecognisable. Where a town had stood, there was now a vast grey plain of hardened mud. The landscape had been completely transformed, smoothed over as if a giant hand had wiped the town off the face of the earth. Here and there fragments remained. A church bell tower buried up to its top, the twisted wreckage of cars and buses, a few rooftops, tilted at strange angles and scattered everywhere. Personal belongings, photographs, shoes, toys and bodies, thousands of bodies, half buried in the mud, many of them frozen in their final moments. Families still holding each other, children clutching dolls, entire households entombed together. Survivors, those who had managed to escape or had been on higher ground when the lahar struck, wandered through the ruins in shock. Many were injured, covered in mud, bleeding. They searched desperately for family members, calling out names, digging through debris with their bare hands. But the mud was already hardening. In the tropical heat, it was drying quickly, setting like concrete. Bodies that had been partially visible at dawn were becoming harder to reach with each passing hour. One of the first outsiders to see the disaster was a pilot from Caribbean Airlines, flying at about 8,000 meters. He noticed an acrid sulfur smell in the cockpit, even at that altitude. When he looked down at the volcano, he saw the snow-capped summit shrouded in black smoke. And when he looked toward where Armero should have been, he saw only a grey expanse. Later, his plane's windshield was found to be etched, chemically scarred by the sulphur in the volcanic plume. News of the disaster spread slowly. Colombia's communication infrastructure had been damaged by the eruption. Phone lines were down. Roads were washed out. It took hours for word to reach Bogotá, and even longer for the full scope of the tragedy to be understood. When rescue teams finally arrived, they found a scene of almost incomprehensible devastation. The Red Cross, the Colombian military, international aid organizations, everyone mobilized as quickly as they could. Helicopters airlifted survivors to hospitals. Heavy machinery was brought in to dig through the mud. Medical tents were set up on the outskirts of what had been Armero. But there were so few survivors to rescue. Most of the victims were beyond help. The mud had set too quickly. Those who had been trapped were either dead from their injuries, or they had suffocated, or they had succumbed to hypothermia in the cold water and mud. For those who were still alive but trapped, rescue efforts were agonizing. Digging them out was slow, dangerous work. The ground was unstable, equipment broke down, workers were exhausted, traumatized by what they were seeing, and the clock was ticking. For every person pulled from the mud alive, there were hundreds who couldn't be, reached in time, the total death toll would eventually be estimated at around 23,000 to 25,000 people. About 20,000 of them were from Armero. Another 1,927 died in the nearby town of Chinchina, which had also been struck by a lahar from a different river valley. It was the second deadliest volcanic disaster of the 20th century, after the eruption of Mount Pelée in Martinique in 1902. One analysis called it history's fourth largest single eruption death toll. But numbers can't capture the enormity of what was lost. Entire families, entire neighbourhoods, entire generations wiped out in a single night. The survivors, those few thousand who made it out, were left to carry the weight of that loss for the rest of their lives. Among the thousands of tragedies that unfolded in Armero that night, one story would come to symbolise the entire disaster. Her name was Omayra Sánchez Garzón. She was 13 years old. When the lahar struck, Omayra was at home with her family. The wave hit their house with such force that it collapsed almost immediately. Omayra was trapped beneath the wreckage, pinned under a door, bricks and other debris. But she was alive. By the time rescuers found her, on the morning of November 14th, she'd been trapped for hours. She was partially submerged in muddy water up to her chest. Her legs were pinned beneath the collapsed structure, and she couldn't move. Rescue workers tried everything they could think of to free her. They brought ropes, saws, and hydraulic equipment. They dug around her carefully, trying to clear the debris without causing further collapse. But the structure holding her down was too heavy, too unstable, and beneath her, deep in the mud, her legs were trapped under a brick wall or door. The exact configuration was unclear, but it was immovable without heavy machinery that couldn't reach her position. Divers went down into the murky water to assess the situation. They reported that her legs were hopelessly pinned. The only way to free her would be to amputate. But there were no medical supplies available, no anaesthetic, no way to perform such a procedure in the field without killing her from shock or blood loss. So they stayed with her. Rescue workers, journalists, volunteers. They brought her food and water. They talked to her. They tried to keep her spirits up. And Omayra, this 13-year-old girl trapped in freezing, contaminated water, knowing she was going to die, stayed calm. She talked about her school, her friends, her family. She asked about her mother and her siblings, not knowing that they had already perished in the mud flow. She prayed. She sang hymns. She comforted the people trying to save her, telling them it wasn't their fault. She stayed there for 60 hours. During that time, journalists from around the world descended on Armero, and many of them found their way to Omayra. Photographers documented her ordeal. Camera crews filmed her. Her face, calm, patient, unbearably sad, appeared on television screens around the globe. One of those photographers was a French journalist named Frank Fournier. He took a photograph of Omayra near the end, when she was exhausted and fading, her eyes dark and haunted, her face half submerged in the water. Fournier would later say, "I felt the image was so strong that it should be seen, but at the same time, I felt that I was doing something that I would have rather not done." That photograph became one of the most iconic images of the 1980s. It won the World Press Photo of the Year award in 1986. It was published in newspapers and magazines around the world, sparking both admiration and controversy. Some praised it as a powerful testament to human suffering and resilience. Others condemned it as exploitative, asking why photographers were taking pictures instead of saving her. But the truth is, no one could save her. On the morning of November the 16th, after 60 hours in the water, Omayra Sánchez died. She died of exposure, gangrene and exhaustion. Her body simply gave out. The rescue workers who had stayed with her wept. Hardened men who had seen unimaginable horrors broke down when she finally closed her eyes. Omayra was buried in a mass grave with thousands of others, but her story and that photograph ensured that she would never be forgotten. She became the face of Armero, the symbol of a disaster that could have been prevented if only people had listened to the warnings. In the weeks and months that followed, the world tried to make sense of what had happened. Search and rescue operations continued for weeks, though they gradually transitioned into recovery efforts. Heavy equipment dug through the hardened mud, uncovering bodies and debris. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of the disaster zone, large pits where the dead were laid to rest, often without identification. Survivors were scattered across Colombia, relocated to temporary shelters, refugee camps, and the homes of relatives. Many of them were traumatized, suffering from survivors' guilt, PTSD, and the overwhelming grief of losing everyone they had ever known. The Colombian government declared a national emergency. International aid poured in from dozens of countries. The Red Cross, the United Nations, and countless relief organizations mobilized resources to help with the recovery. But the questions lingered. How could this have happened? Why weren't people evacuated? Investigations began almost immediately. It became clear that the disaster was not just a natural tragedy. It was a failure of communication, leadership, and decision-making. The hazard map had existed. It had clearly marked Armero as being in the highest danger zone. Scientists had warned repeatedly that lahars were a certainty if a significant eruption occurred. But those warnings had been dismissed, downplayed, or ignored. Local officials blamed the scientists for being alarmists. Scientists blamed the officials for refusing to act. Everyone pointed fingers at everyone else. The truth was more complicated. Colombia, in 1985, was not well equipped to deal with volcanic disasters. Volcano monitoring was rudimentary, communication infrastructure was limited, emergency response systems were underdeveloped, and there was no legal framework for forcing evacuations over the objections of local authorities. But beyond all of that, there was a deeper failure. A failure to believe that the disaster was really coming. The volcano had been quiet for so long. The warning seemed abstract, theoretical, and the harvest was coming, and the economy would suffer, and surely it wouldn't be that bad. By the time reality set in, it was too late. The official damage assessment varied. Initial government tallies put losses at approximately $218 million by December 1985. Broader assessments later placed total losses around $1 billion, with some estimates suggesting the disaster cost nearly 1/5 of Colombia's annual GNP. But the real cost couldn't be measured in money. An entire town had been erased. More than 20,000 lives had been lost. Families had been destroyed. A community that had existed for decades was simply gone. And the survivors, those who'd escaped, carried scars that would never fully heal. The tragedy of Armero forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about how we respond to natural disasters. In the wake of the disaster, 2 American agencies, the United States Geological Survey and the U.S. Agency for International Development's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, came together to launch the Volcano Disaster Assistance Program, known as VDAP. The program's mission was to help countries around the world monitor their volcanoes, interpret warning signs, and coordinate evacuations when necessary. Since its inception, VDAP has aided in more than 30 international volcanic crises. In 2007 at Nevado del Huila in Colombia, authorities evacuated about 12,000 people overnight. No fatalities occurred in Belalcázar. Colombia itself created the Oficina Nacional para la Atención de Desastres, the National Office for Disaster Preparedness, now known as the Dirección de Prevención y Atención de Desastres. All Colombian cities were directed to develop plans for natural disasters. Building codes were strengthened. Warning systems were improved. In time, researchers built a new network of sensors around Nevado del Ruiz. Telemetering seismometers, gas monitors, satellite surveillance. The volcano is now one of the most closely watched in the world. And yet, even with all that technology, even with all that data, Nevado del Ruiz remains a serious threat. The volcano continues to be active. Small eruptions occurred in the years immediately following 1985. Another eruptive period lasted from September 1985 through July 1991. There have been smaller events since then. Up to 500,000 people currently live in areas that could be affected by lahars if another significant eruption were to occur. The glaciers on the summit, though smaller than they were in 1985, still contain enough ice to generate deadly mud flows. Scientists and government officials watch the mountain constantly, knowing that another disaster remains possible. But the survivors of Armero say that all the technology in the world won't matter if people don't listen to the warnings. They say it wasn't the mountain that killed Armero, it was disbelief. Today, if you drive along the main highway that connects Mariquita to Ibagué, you'll pass through what used to be Armero. The highway had to be rebuilt after the disaster, raised almost 2 meters above its original level. Workers who constructed it reported finding body parts and bones buried in the mud. They reported a terrible stench that lingered for months. There's a small visitor centre and museum now, built on the site of the old fire station. Former residents sometimes work there, sharing their stories with visitors who come to pay their respects. If you're fortunate, you might meet someone like Fernando, a survivor who offers to give tours of the town. He'll drive you along the highway, pointing out where buildings used to stand. He'll show you the tree that was completely wiped out by the mudslide, but somehow grew back in exactly the same spot, in the same form. The landscape is strange. Grass now grows over what used to be streets. Palm trees rise where houses once stood. The earth has reclaimed the land, covering the scars with green. But if you look carefully, you can still see remnants. The Central Plaza, Parque Los Fundadores, is marked by the large white cross and a statue of Pope John Paul II, who visited Armero during his July 1986 Colombia trip. He prayed at the site. Around the plaza are several memorials that look like tombs, though nobody is buried in them. It feels like walking through a cemetery without graves. The cupola from the main church sits in large pieces near where the church used to stand. It was found in a field over 2 kilometers away after the disaster, carried by the force of the lahar. There are plaques, photographs, names carved in stone, and there are the trees. Some survivors say there's one tree in particular, they won't say exactly where, that grows white flowers every spring. The same white flowers that gave Armero its nickname. The butterflies still come to them, drifting across the field, weightless and unburdened, unaware of the tragedy beneath their wings. When you stand there, in the silence, the past feels very close. The air is different somehow, heavy, as if the earth itself remembers what happened here. Locals say that on certain nights, especially around November 13th, you can hear echoes, laughter under the soil, church bells that no longer exist, the sound of children playing in streets that aren't there anymore. They say you can see light sometimes, flickering where the town used to be, faint and distant like candles in windows that were buried decades ago. Whether these things are real or just the weight of memory pressing on the land, no one can say. But everyone agrees that Armero hasn't truly disappeared. It's still there, just below the surface, breathing faintly through the earth, waiting to be remembered. Disasters are often measured in numbers. How many lives lost, how many buildings destroyed, how much it cost to rebuild. Around 23,000 to 25,000 dead. estimates ranging from hundreds of millions to around $1 billion in damages. 85% of a town buried in up to 5 meters of mud. But what happened in Armero isn't just statistics. It's a story about human nature, about how easily comfort becomes blindness, and how warnings fade when they don't fit the world we want to believe in. The scientists saw it coming. The hazard map showed exactly what would happen. The warnings were given again and again and again, but warnings require something more than scientific accuracy. They require belief. They require action. They require leaders willing to make difficult decisions based on uncertain information. And when those things are absent, when economic interests outweigh scientific evidence, when disbelief is easier than preparation, the Earth waits patiently for its opportunity to remind us of a fundamental truth. We are guests here. Nevado del Ruiz didn't wake up angry. It simply woke up. It didn't target Armero out of malice. It simply followed the laws of physics. Magma rises, ice melts, water flows downhill. The mountain did what mountains do. It was the people, the officials, the leaders, the ones who dismissed the warnings and prioritized comfort over caution, who failed. And around 23,000 to 25,000 people paid the price. But in that tragedy, there were also moments of profound human dignity. Omayra Sánchez, facing death at 13 years old, showed more courage than most adults ever will. She comforted her rescuers. She sang. She thought about her mother and her school and her friends. She stayed human until the very end. The survivors, traumatized and broken, rebuilt their lives. They formed new communities. They kept the memory of Armero alive, not out of bitterness, but out of love for what was lost, and the world learned. Volcano monitoring systems improved. Warning networks were established. Lives have been saved because of the lessons learned from Armero. The mountain still stands, snow-capped and ancient, watching over the valley where a town used to be. Steam still rises from its crater. Glaciers still cling to its summit, and up to 500,000 people still live in its shadow, trusting that this time, if the mountain speaks again, someone will listen. Because the earth is patient, but it always remembers, and so do we.